the harbor that we went into on the tender. And they would be stuck there in a hotel. And the weather was miserable and there was nothing to do in Harwich, So that was the way we did things out there. The food was wonderful. We had a cook chef, a galley boy, a steward who cleaned up the saloon, ship's engineer, a couple of crewmen, and a captain. You had to have that. You had to have a minimal crew there. And they were all Dutch, the crewmen. I learned a lot of dirty words in Dutch, which I've repeated to a couple of Dutch people. Oh, yeah, you know some Dutch? And I'd say, yeah, and go, blah, 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 and they would go white. Well, you sound like a sailor. Yeah, I learned it from a sailor. Yeah, so there we were. And that was our life. 2 weeks on, 1 week off. When we on our week off, we would be booked to go and do personal appearances in clubs and ballrooms, as they were in those days. And we had a great life. I didn't live at home. All my stuff was in storage, and I stayed at a showbiz hotel in London, like all of us did. And that was our life for a couple of years.
So what was happening when the weather was really bad? As
I'd said earlier, these guys with these wonderful voices, nobody asked us if we were good sailors or not. And when the weather got really, really rough, these guys with the beautiful voices did Technicolor yawns everywhere. It was ugly. I remember one day, our control room. We had a small studio and a control room, and I like to work in the control room because I like to drive my own show. But I remember one day I'd done my shift in the morning, and the weather was really, really rough. And two guys, one after the other, went into the control room to do their shows. And in the early days of Caroline, the chair was on wheels and the microphone was on a boom. So when the ship pitched and tossed, the boom would go one way and the chair would roll the other. It was impossible. When it got rough, we would put pennies on the tone arm. That was the arm on a turntable where the stylus was that sat on the record. And we put these English pennies. There were 2 or 3 or 4 pennies just to hold that arm down on the record while the ship was bouncing around. And there were times, occasionally, that we couldn't play records. And then we would resort to tapes that we'd put together. But all our commercials came out on reels of tape, all in order. There was a studio in Caroline House. That's how the company made money, was the way radio does here in television, commercials. And we all really got on well together. We had a good time out there. We were all a bunch of young guys, and the work wasn't too hard, and there was lots of time to read. And when the weather was beautiful, up on the top deck, laying in the sun and playing guitars and just having a blast. And one of our sponsors was the News of the World, which was one of those sort of raggy kind of newspapers, still is in the UK. And the way we used to get the script for the News of the World was that it would come over in a legal 2-way radio system. And somebody would be up on the bridge and write the script down either late Saturday night or really early in the morning on Sunday. And that it'd be typed up, and then there would be one copy of it, and that was what was used to read the commercial live. And one of our favorite things to do with new guys on board, and it's, hey, you read this live copy. So they'd be reading the script, and somebody would sneak into either the control room or the studio with a lighter and set fire to the top of the script as he was reading it. And so there would be this mad dash to get all the words out before the script completely went up in flames. Our transmitter, we had 50,000 watts. Well, not in those days. We only had about 10,000 watts. But RF, radio frequencies, when you're standing real close to a transmitter, are strong enough to light up a fluorescent light tube. There was a stash of light tubes down in the hold. We found these and took them out on deck one night and held them up to spell a rude word, you, toward the shoreline. Don't know if anybody ever saw that, but we certainly tee-heed about that a lot.
Was BBC pretty pissed off at
Yeah,
this whole
pretty
thing?
much, yeah. You have to remember that there was only BBC and Radio Luxembourg. BBC had the Light program. When they occasionally played records, a lot of it was because of the Musicians' Union, live music. And all the bands of the time would come in and do live from the studio floor. In fact, a lot of those early sessions are available online now. So there was the Light program, there was the Home Service, which was sort of very dry, and news magazines and news and pretty dull stuff for a 15 or 16-year-old and for a lot of 20s and 30-somethings. And then there was the Home Service, which was classical music. And then there was Radio Luxembourg. But that was it. There was no commercial radio in the UK at all, which is why the Pirates became so popular so fast. We were accused of interfering with all kinds of other radio stations, including Vatican Radio, Rome, which was the most powerful transmitter in Europe. But I mean, we were a little 10,000-watt radio station. How could we possibly interfere with Vatican Radio? And they made claims that we interfered with rescue frequencies and airline frequencies. I mean, it was just nonsense. But it was BBC constantly prodding the government to do something about us. So I was with Caroline both north and south, I guess for a year or so. And then in 1966, an American outfit, which was funded by Cliff Radio in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, was one of the board members there, decided that they would bring the American style of radio to the UK. So I got hired on there real early on Swinging Radio England. And that ship was unique in that it had two radio stations on it. One was a top 40 radio station, and the other was Britain Radio, hallmark of quality. And they played a lot of really middle-of-the-road Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, Peggy Lee, Bert Kaempfert, popular music, as it was called then. So there I was, switching allegiances from Caroline to Radio England, and being this yelling, screaming, crazy maniac on the radio, which was the style of radio back in the 60s. If you ever heard Wolfman Jack and all of that stuff, that's style of radio. In fact, I have a clip. Sadly, after about 7 months working there, the Americans decided Radio England wasn't making enough money for them, so they decided to switch from English to Dutch. And Swinging Radio England became Radio Dolphin. And sadly, I lost all of my memorabilia, tapes, everything on my last night in London. I was visiting friends. They took me out to dinner. I left my sample case with all my stuff in it in their apartment, and their apartment was burgled. And my sample case disappeared. And fortunately, there were kids out there with tape recorders who liked to record the pirate radio stations. So I actually have a recording of my last show on the last day of Swinging Radio England.
Let's hear it.
And remember, this is a home recording, and gone down many generations on deteriorated tape since 1966.
More music now. As the sound of the pleasure is bringing us back on the Boss Cafe with a little touch of Music City. Thanks so much to Phil Martin for the news. It's 18 minutes past 1. I tell you, hey Kelly, are you still listening? I just written a little song in your honor. It goes, we all live in a conky hovercraft, a conky hovercraft, a conky hovercraft. Enough said, yes? Okay, buddy. Hey, Charles, this one for you. What a drag is getting old. following starts from Mark and Johnny, yes. Mm-hmm. We all live in a cocky hovercraft. Yeah, lots of respect for Davis Group there, and yeah, keep on running. A song there for Richard Kimball and all that sort of stuff. Friends everywhere, you know. You're listening to the Bobcat Bruce Show from Spring Radio in the last day of the English language transmission. Yes, indeed! On every tree there's a bird. How about that? On every tree there's a bird. Of love. The Olive Rice, that take us out of weather time. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hello. Swinging radio, bring you up to the minute report from the ionospheric weather sector. It will continue cloudy with widespread drizzle and light rain this evening and tonight. Only in the north will there be any bright intervals, and these will only be isolated. Temperatures will fall tonight to about 38 degrees Fahrenheit and rise tomorrow to about 52 degrees. Good night. Good wonderful. Yes. And guess what Bruce has done? He's been sat here happily singing away, and he's going to put a record on. You ever felt foolish? I do. Hang on a minute. Let's see what I got down on the floor. That's another good show. Oh, yes, I know. I know what we're going to play. Yes. I shall now sing 43,000 choruses of We All Live in a Conking Hovercraft. In a conking hovercraft. In a conking hovercraft. Okay, we got a record on now. I've red face underneath panel feeling a right twitch, an electric one. Daisy, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Six thing. Hold tight. Let's go. Hold tight, down the street, gotta take those coming and hold tight, get right around the planet. Yeah, Daisy, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Six, the little old touch, hold tight. 10 before 2 on the Bobcat Bruce Show, the last one on Spring and Radio England. So there you go. And I tell you what, it's all happening for the boys out here. Some of us are going to move next door to Brendex. That's me and one or two other guys. You've all heard of the Uppercut Club, the biggest discotheque in the country, yes, which Billy Walker is opening. It's called the Uppercut. And if you go down there in, in 2 weeks' time, you'll see down there Roger Day, Bill Barry, and Bruce Wade. So it's all happening for all the guys out here, I tell you. Yes, indeed it is. And it's no tearful goodbyes because we're all happy. Or something like that. It's here on this piece of paper. Anyway, we've got another record going out here. This goes out to be from Charles, okay? Let's go. Charles said, what's your favorite record? So I said, Bobby Goldsboro. Voodoo Woman. Sun up in the sky, and you are driving me out of my mind. Sweet is romance. Hey, Kelly, use all three. Don't get you down. Judy Walker and the All-Stars going out to all Pussycat Club members everywhere. How sweet it is to be loved by you. But only you, I tell you. Lovely. Bill Bob Barry, FRE, Swingy Radio England, broadcasting 4.5 miles off the Britain Essex coast on 227 meters, 24 hours per day, in excess of 50,000 watts of power. SRE, first and foremost, is Bob. Play more music. Pow! Bobby, come stop. Let's stop.
And I would come off the air absolutely exhausted, hollering and screaming like a lunatic. But that's what that was, you know, and back in them days. Sorry about the recording quality, but it's the best there is.
It's great.
The reason I kept singing We All Live in a Khaki Hovercraft, a friend of mine who was in the British Army, he was a captain. On my last trip ashore, just a few days beforehand,